Hello and welcome to the 2022 Grant Application Workshop for the Recreational Trails Program. My name is Patty Reed and I am the Outdoor Recreational Grant Planner at Missouri State Parks for the Land and Water Conservation Fund grants. Aiden Dicknight is the Outdoor Recreational Grant Planner for the Recreational Trails Program, and she will be your primary point of contact for the RTP program. What is the Recreational Trails Program, or RTP, as we will be referring to it today during this workshop? The RTP is a federal pass-through grant funded by the Federal Highway Administration and administered in Missouri by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, Division of State Parks, Grant Management Section. It was first created by the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, and it's been through several authorizations since then. It is currently operating under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Infrastructure Investment, and Job Act. Funding for the RTP comes out of the Federal Highway Trust Fund, especially it is federal tax dollars used for non-highway recreation. The funding is dedicated to the development of recreational trails and trail-related facilities such as trailheads, parking lots, etc. Missouri has had RTP funding for about 25 years now, and this map is to show you the geographic distribution of the funds statewide. Nearly $28 million in funding and over 360 projects have been awarded statewide. This map shows the geographic distribution since 2016. The last 5 years have not been added to this map yet. Who can apply? The Recreational Trail Program funds a broad range of applicants. Those include local and state governments, public and private schools, including colleges and universities, and not-for-profit organizations like trail clubs, land trusts, and youth groups. Federal agencies will be allowed to apply for motorized funds only. All applicants who apply for funding must be able to commit to having the trail project open and available for public use for a minimum of 25 years. How does the funding work? It is a matching grant program. The federal share, or the amount that you can request, is up to 80% of the total project cost, which means that you are required to contribute a minimum of 20% match. You can provide more than 20% match, but it is not required. Your match can be all cash or a combination of cash and in-kind contributions such as volunteer labor, in-house labor, or in-house use of equipment. You can also use donations as a part of your match, like labor or equipment. This is a reimbursable program, which means that the cost must be incurred prior to receiving a reimbursement. Subgrantees are encouraged to request reimbursements quarterly, which can help make smaller projects viable. The maximum amount in grant funding that can be requested is $250,000 and the minimum is $25,000. The Federal Highway Administration has not let us know what our 2022 apportionment for the RTP program will be, but we are figuring it should be about the same as last year at $1.3 million. So the question is, what projects are eligible for funding? In Appendix B of the Open Project Selection Process, or OPSP, as I will be referring to it today, you will find the application guide in Appendix B on And then on page 1 and 2 of that guide, there's a pretty thorough list of projects that are eligible. And I've listed just a few of them here. You can do construction of new recreational trails, construction of trail site amenities like overlooks on a trail, signage. You can do trailhead facilities, which would include parking areas, restrooms, or anything related to the trail can be funded with the RTP program. You can also do trail corridors and trail connectors, acquisition of land or right-of-way easements, restoration and repair of existing recreational trails. The funding can be used to rent or lease equipment that will be needed to perform the trail construction or rehabilitation. Funding can also be used for assessment of trail conditions for accessibility and maintenance when it is part of a construction project. Now to talk about some of the projects that are not eligible for RTP funding. Federal Highways has determined that the following kind of projects are inconsistent with RTP legislation. We are just going to talk about some of the most common projects. The first is construction of sidewalks. RTP funds should not be used to provide paths or sidewalks along or adjacent to public roads or streets, unless the path or sidewalk is needed to complete a missing link between other recreational trails. 2. Improvement to roads or bridges intended to be generally accessible by low clearance passenger vehicles such as your regular car, unless the road or bridge has been specifically designated for recreational use by the managing agency. Number 3, one important change to the program is that funding can no longer be used to purchase equipment. The purchase of any equipment is no longer allowable because it must comply with the provisions of Buy America. The Buy America provision states that any iron or steel production, including protective coatings, that are permanently incorporated in an RTP project must be from a domestic manufacturing process. In the past, applicants could apply and request a waiver, but the Federal Highway Administration is not currently issuing Buy America waivers. So we have been asked not to request funding for equipment purchases at this time. RTP funds cannot be used for condemnation of any kind of interest in the project. Also, if the project proposal solely is for the purpose of trail planning, this would not be eligible. But if trail planning is a relatively small portion of an overall trail project, it may be allowable. A project proposal for the purpose of performing a trail feasibility study would not be eligible. Note here is the link to the Federal Highway RTP website with guidance about RTP. So, how do you apply? The first step is the one that everyone is doing right now, which is attend the Grant Application Workshop. The second is completing the application, which is located at the RTP website, and submitting the application to the grants management section by mailing 2 hard copies to the address at the bottom of the application form. The forms cannot be emailed. The applications must be postmarked or received by Wednesday, February 16th, 2022. If you want us to take a look at your draft application and provide you with some feedback, we offer a courtesy review of the application if it is sent to us by January 31st, 2022. Applications that are requesting a courtesy review can be emailed, either the whole or part of the application, to the Grants Management section at the email on the bottom of the screen, mspgrants@dnr.mo.gov. You do not have to mail in requests for a courtesy review in order to submit a final application. This is just a courtesy review that we offer to help you with your application. Our firewall allows for a file size that is up to 7 megabytes. So if you are sending a lot of documents for the courtesy review, please do so in several emails. Write in the subject line, RTP Courtesy Review. I have also included our telephone numbers here. You can call us if you have questions. Once again, Aiden is your primary point of contact. Myself, Patty, is here, and then Rebecca, our section chief, is also here to help you. Please don't let the questions in the application overwhelm you. If you don't understand how to answer a question, step 1 is to read the instructions in the OPSP, and the second is to call us. So what happens after you send in your application and all your supporting documentations? After all the applications have been received, we prepare a packet containing all the applications that are eligible for scoring and scoring sheets for the Missouri Trail Advisory Board. This is a citizen advisory board made up of 9 members. Board members are selected for their trail expertise and represent 9 different types of trail use, like equestrian, off-highway motorcycle, water trails, mountain biking, and bicycling trails. The board members will take a look at your application individually and score it based on criteria listed on the scoring sheet at the end of the OPSP packet. The grant application guide explains how the points are allocated to each section. After scoring all the application, the board is scheduled to convene on April 9th to discuss the merits of each application and prepare a list of projects recommended for funding. The grants management section will submit that list to our division director for his preliminary approval. Once we get his approval, we contact the applicants of the projects that have been preliminarily selected and schedule a pre-approval site inspection to verify that everything in the application is as it was described. We will also conduct our risk assessment at the time to evaluate your capacity of complying with the requirements of the grant. Us contacting you to schedule a pre-approval site inspection and risk assessment is your clue that you have made it to the next step of the application process. Once we complete those pre-approval site inspections and risk management, which is generally between May and June, we will put together a list of projects recommended for funding to send to our division and department directors for approval. We will also send the list of projects to the Federal Highway Administration for their approval. The notices of award, project agreement, and regret letters will be sent out to the applicants in the fall, which is typically in October. At that time, applicants of projects that have been awarded will be invited to attend a mandatory grant administrative workshop where we will discuss oversight and management of the project, as well as long-term stewardship requirements. After you attend the mandatory workshop, we send you a letter with your first notice to proceed with phase 1 of your project, and then you have 3 years to complete your project from start to finish. So for just a little fun, we're going to play something called RTP Application. This sort of gives you a reminder of how all this process works. So the first step is completing and submitting your application and supporting documents to the grants management staff. The second roll of the dice is the Trail Advisory Board reviewing and then scoring and ranking your application. And that's a chance square on the board. So the roll 3 of the dice is when you receive a notice of award letter and project agreement from us, which basically says you pulled the right chance card, you're moving on. Then the fourth stage of the game is that you attend a mandatory grant administrative workshop where we cover the state and federal requirements for environmental review and for purchasing and procurement. And you are allowed to start administering your grant at that point. The next stage is you conducting the environmental review or NEPA review. The National Environmental Policy Act requires a review to make sure your project isn't negatively impacting any resources. Once you complete the environmental review and send us the supporting documentations, we take a look at it and then we send it to the Federal Highway Administration to see if your project qualifies as a category exclusion, which means there's no further review needed. Federal Highways takes a look at it and lets us know if they concur or not. At that point, we send you a letter that says you have notice to proceed, your project is a category exclusion, you may now begin to incur costs. You cannot do anything until you have a letter from us that states your project has a category exclusion. And the next step 7, when you start incurring costs. And 8 is when you start making your quarterly reimbursement requests for expenses that you've incurred throughout the life of your project. So now that we've kind of talked about the process itself, how to apply and what happens after you apply, I want to show you where to download the application. It is on our website and is electronic form, so you can download it freely. We do recommend that you use Adobe for downloading and completing the application. Several individuals in the past have contacted us about issues they have with filling out the form with other programs, so please use Adobe. The free version will work for you of Adobe. Handwritten applications will not be accepted. You can email us your draft application, but when you are ready to submit your final applications, you must submit 2 hard copies of the final application. Also here, you will notice the Open Project Selection Process. Once again, that's the OPSP, and that is the directions for filling out the application. So you should download that as well. And then later on, we will post this workshop to the website, and it will be right below that at the Grant Application Workshop. You will see the YouTube video that this will become. The next part of this presentation will be us walking you through the grant application step by step and discussing how to answer the questions. Hopefully everyone has the opportunity to download the application and you can follow along. On the first page of the application, question 1, this is the name of the agency or organization requesting the grant. So this is who is actually applying for and will be administering the grant once actually awarded. The receiving official should match the name or title in the resolution and will also be the person signing the application. Question 3 is the name of the person who is preparing the application. So if you hired someone to prepare the application, or if it's your local RPC that is helping you, that is the name of the person who goes here. If we have questions about the application itself, we are going to contact the application preparer. But if we have questions about the grant and the project, we will be contacting the person in question 4. This is the person who will be administering the grant if it is awarded. This is also the person who needs to attend the mandatory application workshop. Question 5 through 8 ask about your representative and Regional Planning Commission, or RPC. These are people who will be notified if the grant application is awarded. Question 9 is the specific question asking where the project is located. For instance, the county, township, range, section, and also the latitude and longitude. If you have a trailhead, the latitude and longitude will be at the trailhead, or it will be at the starting point if you are continuing a trail. Please use decimal degrees for the latitude and longitude. Question 10 through 12 ask you to provide information about your organization's background and prior performance with DNR. Pursuant to 2 CFR 200, we are required to conduct a risk assessment of all applicants to ensure that we are being good stewardships of taxpayer dollars and that we are only awarding grants to entities that have the capacity to manage the project. The answers given in this section provide some information about your organization. If you are selected to move to round 2, which is the pre-award site inspection and risk assessment, you will be asked to provide additional information to help us complete the risk assessment process. We will ask for such things as your most recent audit, accounting and procurement policies and procedures. Make sure to answer these questions based on the organization listed in question 1. So, for example, if the City of Missouriville Park and Recreation Department is the applicant, the information in this section should reflect the department as opposed to the city as a whole, and vice versa. In question 12, please note that we are asking you to provide performance history information for grants received by DNR as a whole and not just the RTP program. So this would include grants such as LWCF or other RTP, historic preservation fund grants, scrap tire, or even the clean water grants, just to name a few. Please be sure to provide adequate information so that we can verify this information with other grant managers. Also note that this is the first time within the application that points are given to a section. Since we strive to distribute the grants throughout the entire state, a project sponsor who has never received an RTP grant would receive more points than a project sponsor with an active RTP grant. Question 13 through 21 are the questions that ask you to describe your project. The first one, question 13, asks what category your project falls into. The reason for this is that we have 5 categories for projects, which are non-motorized single use, non-motorized diverse use, both non-motorized and motorized diverse use, motorized single use, and finally, motorized diverse use. It's kind of confusing, so that's why I want to explain what each type is. The reason that we do this is because federal regulations state that for the RTP grants, we are required to fund the projects at a 30-30-40 ratio. So 40% of projects must be of diverse use. So that is more than one use. 30% of the funds go to motorized projects. The reason is that this is because this is where the funding comes from, the fuel tax. And then 30% can be single use, non-motorized. So an example of a non-motorized single use would be a trail open to just walkers or a water trail that is just for kayaking and canoeing, something that's non-motorized. An example of a non-motorized diverse use trail would have at least two different types of use. And as you see, you'll get additional points for having diverse use. So for example, it could be a hiking and biking trail, or maybe it's a biking and equestrian trail. And just to let you know that e-bikes are currently considered to be non-motorized. An example of a non-motorized, motorized diverse use would be a water trail where you allow kayakers and canoers, but you would also allow boaters with outboard motors. In order to be motorized use, at least 60% of the total project cost must be for the motorized side. Another example would be a trail that would allow ATV use as well as making it an equestrian trail. And these uses can actually be seasonal dependent. So for example, you allow ATVs in the spring, summer, and fall, and then you allow equestrian in the winter. That still does count for a non-motorized, motorized diverse use because 60% of the cost is for the motorized part of the project. A motorized single use would be if you built an ATV or UTV trail that was only for that type of use. And then let's say you built a trail that can accommodate both ATVs and motorbikes. So you can see the more diverse your project is, the more points you will receive. Question 14 on the application asks whether your project is new development or rehabilitation and repair of an existing project. So let's say you have a project that's both. You're going to build a new section of trail, but you're also going to be rehabbing what's on the ground. If 60% of the total budget costs are for the new construction, then it would be considered a new development, or vice versa. After you choose if your new development or rehab, under each one, there are boxes and you must tell what you will be doing. Are you building a new trail construction, new trail side and trailhead amenities, and a new trail connector to existing areas? And choose all of from those three that apply. And then you'll note that you have the same categories under rehabilitation and repair. So, are you doing an existing trail, existing amenities, and an existing connector? Mark all that apply. Then there are also boxes to indicate whether or not you are going to be acquiring property or an easement. And just to let you know, we're going to discuss acquisition of real property on the next slide. But if you know you're going to need a temporary or a permanent trail easement, you would mark this box as well. Question 15 and 16 ask you where your project is going to be constructed. If the project sponsor owns or leases the property, a deed or lease agreement must be submitted with your application. The lease must be for a minimum of 25 years, and signature of owner or other interest holders acknowledging the 25-year commitment to maintain an outdoor recreation. If the project sponsor has a permanent trail easement or a temporary construction easement, a copy of the easement agreement must be submitted as well. Or, in the case of projects on state or federal land, a draft memorandum of agreement or an MOA between the agency and the sponsor must be submitted. The MOA must commit the land managing agency to maintain public access to the project for a minimum of 25 years and acknowledge their commitment to record the declaration of deed restriction to the deed of property. The agreement must also give the project sponsor access to construct on the property and must outline the roles and responsibility for bidding or contracting for any design and construction work involved in the project. If the application is a non-for-profit organization constructing on public land, the landholding agency must also agree to fulfill the 25-year stewardship requirement should the non-for-profit organization dissolve before the end of the stewardship period. If this applies, please notify the grants management staff during the application phase. If recommended for funding, a signed memorandum of agreement must be executed prior to the award of grant fund. So my example here is, if you own the land, we will need your deeds. If you do not own the land that you are constructing on, you will need to go to the property owners and have an MOA developed. And we will need to see that draft. That draft should indicate in the MOA that the landowners understand that they must maintain this trail for 25 years and that they will be putting the declaration of deed restriction on the property. This should be negotiated between the landowner and the sponsoring agencies, the ones receiving the grant. That way, if you make it into the next round and are getting ready to receive an award, that MOA can be signed and sent to us before you receive your award. Question 17 asks you to list any present, existing, or reasonably anticipated liens or mortgages or both on the property and the effect of the recreational easement that will be required, and are there any right-of-ways, easement, or reversionary interests associated with the project. Identify outstanding mortgages, loans, etc., the amount that is still owed, and describe how this will affect the current project. If you will be required to get a loan to complete this project, please indicate how much you anticipate borrowing and for what duration. Because the property located within the RTP project will be dedicated to public outdoor recreation for 25 years, it is important to identify any parties who have a superior interest in that land. Please list all right-of-ways, easements, permanent or temporary, or reversionary interests associated with this site. In question 18 asks you to tell us what the intended use of the project is. So this kind of goes back to the top question. And I want you to make sure that you click all that apply. So we want you to tell us whether the trail can accommodate the biking, walking, jogging, hiking, backpacking, equestrian, canoeing, kayaking, motorized vehicles, ATVs, UTVs, etc. Page 17 of the application guide has a pretty thorough definition of each type to use to help you decide which category that your project falls under. The Recreational Trails Program prohibits condemnation of any kind of interest in the property. Therefore, acquisition or lease of land or right-of-way easement on which to develop a trail project must be from a willing landowner. Additionally, acquisition of real property interest through easement or lease agreement must be for a minimum of at least 25 years. Provisions stated in the easement or lease agreement cannot be detrimental to the proposed recreational development. The easement or lease agreement must also state that it cannot be revoked at will by the landowner and that the land must be retained in public trail use for the duration of the easement or lease period. All acquisition of real property with RTP funds, whether through purchase, donation, easement, or lease, must comply with the Uniform Relocation Act of Real Property Acquisition Policy Act of 1970 as amended. Also known as the Uniform Act, this act applies to acquiring property with non-federal funds when the intent is to apply for RTP funds for development of a trail project. In other words, a project sponsor can't knowingly circumvent the federal law by acquiring real property with local funds and not follow the guidance of the act, and then apply for RTP funds at a later date to develop a trail or trailhead. The Uniform Act ensures that landowners are fully informed of their rights and are justly compensated when selling or leasing private property or selling or leasing any type of interest in their projects, such as a trail easement or temporary construction easement. As part of this assurance, the Uniform Act requires a Yellow Book appraisal and an appraisal review to be performed. Additionally, the Act also covers the provision of relocation assistance to owners or tenants displaced by this acquisition. Costs that are eligible to be included in the budget under the Phase 2 are costs for acquiring property by fee title, or the use of the property by permanent or temporary easement, and the incidental costs including appraisal fees, title searches, preparation of surveys, plats, and property description. It is important to remember that if you will need a temporary construction easement, land acquisition, or permanent trail easement, that you don't acquire the land until you receive the award and the right-of-way has been approved by federal highways. So one note I wanted to note here is that with LWCF, some of these cannot be used with grant funds, but with RTP, you can get reimbursed for your appraisal fees, your title searches, and if you have to have it surveyed to have a legal description done. That can all be paid for with grant funding in Phase 2. The next two slides here show an example of the declaration of deed restriction that will be placed on the deed of the property where the trail or trailhead is located if you are awarded to a grant. This is something that everyone who receives an award will have to place on their property. So whether you are constructing on someone else's property or your own property, this deed restriction will need to go on the property. You will also, if you note here on page 1 of this declaration of deed restriction, it is asking for a legal description of the trail corridor and or the trailhead. So when you are developing your trail, we are not asking you to encumber the entire property, just the trail corridor and the trail head. But if you are within a park, you can do the entire park as your legal description because most likely you are developing a loop trail that goes throughout the entire park. And then here is page 2 of that declaration of deed restriction. Once again, I want to stress that if you are constructing on someone else's property within the MOA, it will need to clearly state that the landowner understands that they will be doing this declaration of deed restriction on the property once the project is completed. The declaration of deed restriction can be found on our RTP website under related content so that you can take a copy of this with you when you are negotiating your MOA. Question 19 is a pretty important question because this is the title of your project with the current phase. We are asking for a very short but descriptive title because this is what's going to be on any correspondence between us and you. And it will go on all the notices to proceed letters plus the project agreement. So if you'll note, this is a very descriptive one. It says Wolf Creek Trail Improvements Phase 3. Then in question 20 is where you should provide a full scope of work for your project. You should tell us specifically what is being constructed, repaired, and or acquired. Is this a new project? Is it one phase of a larger project? What exactly do you plan to accomplish with this grant? And how do you plan to accomplish it? So who will be doing the work? The narrative should talk about the project limits. For a trail, we want to know where does it start and where does it end? What type of surface material will be present? How long will it be? How wide will it be? Is this a spur to an existing trail? Is this for repairs or new construction? Is this for amenities? When I read this section of the application, I should be able to tell you what you are doing for this project. So make it very clear what is being constructed in this phase of the project versus future phase. We recommend that you talk about the current phase at the very top of this question, and then at the bottom, you can briefly mention what will be completed in future phases. So now I want to show you some examples of a scope of work. Our first one here is we plan to build an additional 1.2 miles of concrete trail in Trail City, Missouri as an extension to the Wolf Creek Trail. As you can see here, I do not have very much information. I don't know where in Trail City this will be. All I know is how long it's going to be and that it's going to be concrete. I don't even know how wide the trail will be. So I don't know if it's going to be ADA accessible or not. So this is an incomplete scope of work. Here is an example of a good scope of work. The existing Wolf Creek Trail is a 7.5 mile trail that stretches from Wolf Creek Park 1001 Wolf Creek Avenue, Missouriville, Missouri, to Trail Park, 200 Hiking Avenue, Trail City, Missouri. We are requesting funding to complete the final phase of this trail project, which will add an additional 1.2 miles of 8-foot wide paved concrete trail and extend the trail from its current terminus in Trail Park to Trail City's public school at 100 Main Street. A map of the project area has been included to show both the existing trail and the proposed trail extension. If awarded, the funding will be used to hire an engineer to design the trail to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and oversee the construction. Grant funds will be used to pay for materials used to construct the trail, for trail sign and safety lighting. Trail City plans to use its in-house construction crew to construct the trail. 20 trees will be removed within the trail corridor from November to March only. Now, question 20 asks you to explain who the project is going to benefit and why the project is needed. This is your opportunity to sell it to the Missouri Trail Advisory Board on the merits of your project. So try and answer as many of these questions as you can. So if you have a specific group that you are targeting, tell us who that is. Is it perhaps someone who is underserved, such as low income? Is it for the elderly? Are you making your trail ADA accessible? Make sure to tell us about that. Tell us about the unique features of your projects that you might be connecting this to a National Historic Trail or a National Recreation area. Or will you be connecting it to one of the long distance trails, such as the Katy Trail? Is there an urgency to complete this project? And there might be an urgency because there's a safety issue, especially if you're doing repairs to a trail. If a trail is in disrepair and can't be used, you are making it safe now. So tell us about that. Are you addressing certain environmental issues? Are you taking your trail from a natural trail and now you're going to make it ADA accessible? Sell your project here. The next section, question 22 through 29, you'll notice that the whole section has up to 35 points that can be awarded. So this is a pretty important section. And if you notice, each question tells you how many points that specific question is worth. So question 21 is asking you how this project meets a need identified either in a local, regional, or statewide management plan. So if your project is mentioned in a plan, definitely refer to that plan here and then send us a copy of the section of the master plan that you mentioned. Don't send us the whole plan, just send us the couple of pages with your supporting document. Also take the time to describe how this project aligns with the SCORP priority. SCORP is the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreational plan, which is a 5-year planning document that identifies outdoor recreation issues of statewide significance and evaluates the supply of and demand for outdoor recreation resources and trails needed throughout Missouri. So if you take a look at the SCORP, you will find it on our website. I recommend that you go to page 73 through 76 of the SCORP and identify which goal or object your project will meet and state the number and explain how the project will meet that need. My hint to you is to really look at goal 2 because this discusses trail needs in Missouri. Another really important part of this section is if you've solicited public opinion in your community. We want to see that you've engaged the public, because if the public is engaged, then obviously that means they're going to use your trail project in the future. This can be illustrated to us in a number of different ways. So maybe you've held a public meeting or you did a Facebook poll. It demonstrates that there is actually a need and demand for the project. Make sure to include a copy of documents that show you completed the public engagement, such as flyers, minutes of meetings, sign-in sheets, results taken, etc. One thing we also want to see is if you've had any negative pushback to your project. We would like to hear about that and how you have addressed the citizens concerned. Now, if you have not done public outreach in the last 12 months, just mark it as no and understand that if you move into the next round and are awarded a grant, you will be required to do public outreach as part of your NEPA review. Question 24 asks you to identify which accessibility standards are being addressed and to describe accessibility challenges that exist and how you plan to overcome them. You should indicate how the project meets Americans with Disability Act, ADA, and the Architectural Barrier Act, ABA standards. Explain any challenges that impact your ability to comply with ADA and ABA standards and how the project's design will overcome the challenges. The projects that use RTP funding for the development of trailhead amenities such as restrooms, parking areas, access routes, shelters, drinking fountains, benches, these facilities must be ADA compliant. For your convenience, an accessibility checklist has been posted at the RTP website that provide ADA design standards for the most common trailhead-related amenities, such as your parking, your access routes, your restroom facilities, water fountains, and overlooks. Project sponsors are encouraged to consult with a design professional for further assistance to ensure ADA and ABA compliance. Now, when it comes to the construction of your trail, it may not be practical to implement accessibility standards for your trail development, as opposed to the trailhead development projects. However, you are still encouraged to consider providing access to the greatest extent possible for your project. There are several conditions or exceptions that may preclude making a trail accessible. For instance, a trail intender user group may make it impossible to design and construct a trail that is ADA accessible. An example of this would be a trail that you are developing for mountain bikes. Below are links to ADA requirements for the project. For your benefit, we have also designed a checklist to help you, which can be located on the RTP website. So if you go to page 22 of your application guide in the OPSP, there are resources for accessibility guidelines for development of trails for other than pedestrian use, so such as an equestrian trail. So just remember that when you are building a trailhead and trailhead amenities, those must comply with ADA and ABA standards. A trail does not necessarily have to be ADA compliant. One thing I do want to mention is that if you mention in your scope of work that your trail will be ADA accessible, then you must meet that requirement, and should explain that here on how you plan to meet that requirement. Question 25 asks, do you currently manage any trails? If you answer yes, we want to know what type of trails. Are they concrete, asphalt, or natural? How many of each of these trails do you have, and what is the use of the trails? Include a map or a brochure of the trail system with your supporting documentation. Since the Trail Advisory Board is looking to distribute the funding throughout Missouri and to help communities develop trails, more points are given to this question for communities that do not have trails or that their trail is closing a gap in their trail system, that if they're creating water trails or interactive elements or renovating trails that will meet ADA standards. Questions 26 ask about environmental factors that have been or will be addressed, and has an environmental review been completed recently in the project area. We just want to know that you're starting to think about the environment because it's going to be a big part of your project administration. We want you to describe what steps you will take to avoid impact to cultural or historic resources or threatened endangered species, such as removing trees only from November to March in order to protect the bats. What steps will you take to try and prevent the spread of invasive species, such as you're going to be planting native landscaping? Or what steps will you take to be a good neighbor, like to minimize trespassing? If your project area has had an environmental review, please include a copy of that report with your supporting documentation. You should summarize the results of the report, such as name whichever federal agency reviewed the environmental, and then say they completed an environmental review of the park and it has a CE clearance. So an example of this would be if you are developing a trail within a park and say a couple years ago you had an LWCF grant to add play equipment to your park. The National Park Service conducted an environmental review and gave you a CE clearance of the park. You would want to include that and tell Federal Highways that this has already been done and they gave the CE. Question 27 asks you to describe what sustainable conditions you will be addressing. For instance, are you preventing or minimizing erosion? Are you going to be doing something that conserves energy, such as installing solar lights? Are you going to be thinking about any other factors? And if so, what are those factors going to be? One good example is that now they make solar benches for charging cell phones. So are you going to place one of those along your trail? Question 28 asks, what safety concerns will you be addressing in your project? Such as, will you have an appropriate trail width? Is it going to be an adequate sight line at trail crossings? Overhead clearance? Lighting, trail signs, or vehicle barriers? Question 29 asks about construction and rehabilitation and who is going to be doing this work for each phase. If you intend to use in-house labor for the construction of the project, you must now submit a cost analysis that compares in-house labor to contract labor. You are needing to prove that your in-house labor is more cost efficient than using contract labor. So if you're going to, and that's if you're using in-house or volunteer labor, you need to say how it's more cost efficient and demonstrate that with numbers than hiring a contractor to do the work. But if, let's say in phase one, you plan to hire an engineer to do the design work, tell us that, and then tell us who's going to be doing the construction. Please do not list specific vendors in this section because you will need to follow the procurement and bidding processes that we will cover in the administrative workshop later. So just let us know who you are going to have do each phase of the work. In question 30, ask you to provide a detailed post-completion plan for your project. Project sponsors are required to maintain all RTP construction projects for public access for a minimum of 25 years. This question is designed to get you to demonstrate to us that you have the resources and a plan for the project's long-term care. After you complete the RTP project, you will be required to record that declaration of deed restriction to all the deeds where the trail is constructed. So if you are building on your own land, then you need to tell us how you're going to maintain it. If you are constructing on someone else's land and you have that MOA, in the MOA, it should state who will be maintaining that trail for the 25 years. Is it going to be the project sponsor, or is it going to be the agency that owns the land? And it must be open to the public for 25 years. Question 31 through 32 ask you to talk about partnerships and donations associated with your project. Question 31 is about youth groups working on your project. The federal guidelines for RTP really emphasize the use of qualified youth or service corps as a component of your project. A lot of grant recipients do use AmeriCorps or Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. So if you have some way to do that, that can get you additional points. Examples would be an AmeriCorps crew that helped you build a portion or all of the trail. Or maybe you have an Eagle Scout or a Girl Scout Gold Award who wants to help build your kiosk. The next question, question 32, asks you to list donors to your project. This is actual third-party donations from somebody else. List only donors who are contributing in a truly tangible way. Do not list vendors who are promising discounts on projects or services since you will go through a procurement process. If you are using federal funds or another federal grant as match for this grant, you will need to list it here. You will also need to include in your supporting documentation the statute or regulation that allows you to use these funds as match for the RTP grant. Federal Highways has let us know that ARPA funds cannot be used as match for the RTP grant. You will need to provide letters of commitment here from your donors that says that yes, they plan to commit a donation to the project if funded and the value of that donation. The total of the donations listed here should equal the total of donations that you will place into the budget table, question number 34. So once again, if someone is truly contributing to your project and plans to donate, they will need to be listed here. and you will also need that supporting letter. Do not put what the city is or the project sponsor will be contributing to the project here. That is not what goes here. This is truly just for your donations. Question 33 asks what financial assurances you have to complete the project in 3 years. This is a reimbursable grant, so you will need upfront cash to begin the project and enough manpower to finish the project. Supporting documentations for this includes letters of commitment and intent to donate from your partners, a resolution, and a financial assurance letter. A template for the resolution and financial assurance letter can be found on pages 8 through 9 of the application guide in the OPSP. In question 34, we are asking you to provide a cost estimate for your project broken down in one of 3 phases. One big change to the scoring this year is that now you will receive up to 7 points for quality and accuracy of the budget table and budget narrative. You need to make sure that the table and the narrative equal each other and that everything listed in your scope of work from question 20 is listed in the budget narrative and vice versa. The donation column should match the total from question 32. It is very important to make sure that your budget is accurate. So please pay special attention that when you put something here, that this total matches what you're going to write in the narrative, and then everything that's in the budget narrative is also in the scope of work. And if you put something in the scope of work, we should see it here in the table. So this is broken down by 3 phases. So phase 1 is the planning, engineering, and environmental review expenditures. In this phase, you would include costs associated with the environmental review process, such as maybe an archaeological or cultural resource survey, and then the costs associated with designing your project, such as the engineering and the development of your bid packets. Please note, only 10% of the total project costs can be in phase 1. So if you have a $100,000 project, only $10,000 can be in this phase. Phase 2 is right-of-way acquisition. So costs associated with right-of-way, such as your temporary construction easement, the purchase or donation of land, and appraisals can all be here. Even if you need to get a legal description of your property, it can go here in phase 2. Phase 3 should include all costs associated with construction, which means everything from labor, material, and your equipment use. Make sure to break your costs down by columns. If it's a cost that you are asking the grant to pay for, place it in column 1. If you are the project sponsors are paying for it, place it in column 2. If the contribution is being made by the third-party donor, place it in column 3. Remember that this total should match what is in question 32. In each of these columns, only use whole numbers, no decimals, no commas. Round everything up to the nearest dollar. Down at the bottom, you will see the percentage of matching funds. This will automatically self-total, and this is the matching share and how your reimbursements will be paid out. it needs to say at least 20%. Here, if it does not say 20%, then you have not divided your funds appropriately between the grant request and the matching funds. So make sure that says at least 20. If you look at the table on the right, you can see that project sponsors can receive additional points for overmatching on a project. But be aware that your project will be funded at the cost share ratio submitted in your application. So if you write the application for a 60-40 split, if you are awarded, that will be the percentage you will be reimbursed for the entire grant project. We will not be reducing funds on the matching share side if the costs come in under budget. Both the federal award and matching share will be reduced proportionately. Each phase of the project should be split by the same matching share percentage if there are costs in the grant request column. If the cost is only matched in phase 1 and phase 2, it will not be split by the percentage with phase 3. It will be a total project then. So here's the example. So if you have design work that is being procured after the award, and let's say it's $10,000, if our matching share percentage is 60-40, then 6,000 would go under the grant request in phase 1, and 4,000 would go under the project sponsor. But if the engineering firm is donating their time to design the project, then all 10,000 would go into the donation column, the donation by third party column, plus I should see this listed in question 32, plus I would have a letter stating that they are donating their services. If the design work is being completed by our city engineer, which is then again match only, it would all be placed under the project sponsor. Question 25 is where we are asking you to give us a detailed budget for the project by phase. All costs listed in the budget table, question 34, should be listed in the budget narrative. Don't just list what the grant is paying for, you need to include the donations and the project sponsor's match. Remember, the cost in question 35 should equal the cost in question 34 and vice versa. Also remember that if you listed it in the scope of work, question 20, we should see it listed in the budget narrative and vice versa. Note the maximum time frame for completion of each phase and include the estimated completion date in month and year for each part, assuming a start date of October 15, 2022. So for our phase 1 cost, the expenditures have been broken down by environmental, engineering, and other. And the table has been filled out so you can see what it would look like. Do not specify any vendors or brand names in your estimates. If awarded, you will be required to follow a competitive bid process. If any of the costs in phase 1 are pre-award costs or donations, make sure to include that information in the narrative. Pre-award costs can only be costs incurred up to 18 months prior to the construction authorization date, not from when the application is submitted or from when you receive the award. It is from the date of construction authorization, which, if there is a delay in your NEPA or with your right-of-way, may not come for a year to a year and a half after your start date. So please be careful when you're putting in pre-award cost. So note here on, this is an example from a trail. Let's say that I'm building. So I think during my Section 106 review, I'm going to have an archaeological survey that needs to be done, and I'm planning on about $2,000 for that. I have a an engineering firm that has already said that they would design my trail and my bridge. So these are going to be pre-award costs. They are planning to be done by the end of January 2022. So I'm calling that out, and I'm going to include the invoice that I paid them in with my supporting documents. And then down under other, I have the advertisement for construction bid. Then in phase 2, which is the right-of-way acquisition, I know that I'm going to have to get a temporary construction easement along the way, and I am planning on about $500 for that. But if my project did not have to include any right-of-way because I own all the property, then I can either leave this section blank or I could just write no right-of-way needed for this project. Then as we go on to phase 3, which is the construction, this needs to be a detailed breakout of my cost. So if in labor, I'm planning on using my in-house labor, I would take how many hours I figured they're going to work. I would take their current salary and I would put those numbers here. If I've had some people say that they plan to volunteer to help me with my trail, I can figure that at $12 an hour and put how many hours I think they're going to be working and how many volunteers, and I would come up with a total for that. If I'm going to hire a contractor to come in and do my work, I would list how much I'm estimating their cost of labor would be here. Then in the next section is materials, and materials would be anything and everything that you need to construct your project. So if I'm building a restroom, the cost for the restroom would go here. If I'm building benches, the cost of the benches, the lighting. As you can see, I've got the bridge decking here, and I'm going to tell you how many square feet of lumber I'm going to need and what the cost of that lumber is and get a grand total. I'm also putting rebarb in my concrete, so I will have that cost as well. Now, one thing I want you to please be aware of is remember the Buy America provision when you are looking at costs for iron and steel. Please remember that all iron and steel permanently incorporated into your project must meet the Buy America provision, which means it had to have been manufactured here in the US. So when you're asking and trying to get quotes on prices, make sure that you are quoting a price for rebarb that has been produced here in the US and will meet the Buy America provision. One thing I also want to make you aware of that is if you are having items donated to the project, such as benches, picnic tables, that too needs to meet the Buy America provision. So you need to make sure that if they are donating something, that it has been made with products that meet the Buy America provision. The next, you're going to talk about equipment. If I have to go out and rent a piece of equipment, I'm going to put the cost there. Now, if I'm using my in-house equipment, you will need to use the 2019 FEMA rate of schedules, and that will give you the cost per hour to operate a piece of your in-house equipment. And then down below is signs. So you might have your interpretive signs that you're going to be putting along the trail or directional signs. And then everyone is required at the end of the project to have an RTP acknowledgement sign, usually at your trailhead or the start of your trail. And that cost is right around $40. So you can put that in because that is a grant expense. Now I kind of want to go through the eligible cost. You can see here that you can put into your budget table and your project narrative. This information is in the application guide on page 24 through 25, but I do just want to kind of go through it real quick. So remember, if you are hiring a contractor to do the work, that can either be paid for by the grant or it can be sponsors match. If you're using in-house labor is only match for the project. And if you're using volunteer labor, you can figure them up as $12, and that is only on the match side. Okay. For materials can be either a grant expense or a project sponsor or a donation. Just remember that all materials must meet the Buy America provision. For equipment, if you are leasing or renting a piece of equipment, that can either be a grant request or it can be sponsor match. But if you're using in-house labor, that can only be on the match side, the sponsor match side. Or if someone is donating their equipment to you, that is also only on the match side. For land and easement acquisition, remember that all land acquisitions must meet the Uniform Act of 1970 as amended, but it can be paid for with grant funding or by the sponsors. If the land is being donated or the easement is being donated, then that can be sponsor match. Okay, but if you are using the land donation, you will need to have a yellow book appraisal and review appraisal completed in order to get the value of the land for donation. So I recommend if you're dealing with donated land that you contact us and have us work with you on how to get those cost estimates. For planning, engineering, and the environmental review, remember this cost cannot exceed 10% of your total budget cost, but if you are going to hire an engineer firm as part of your grant, then you can have a grant request for that, or it can be sponsors match. If you have it as a pre-award cost, that can only be on the sponsor match side. And if someone is donating their services to you, that is only on the match side. Then, of course, signs can either be a grant request or sponsor match, as well as printing publications such as trails brochures. On page 25 of the application guide in your OPSP are some costs that are ineligible for RTP funding. And I just kind of wanted to go through that. The first one is routine trail maintenance, which means work that should be conducted on a frequent basis in order to keep a trail in its originally constructed state, such as mowing, tree and bush pruning, leaf and debris removal, cleaning and repairing of culverts. And something that's also not eligible are overhead costs, and this would include regular operating expenses such as the building rent or upkeep, utilities, insurance, and fixed costs associated with a business, agency, or a group. You cannot include law enforcement costs. You cannot include costs of a non-eligible sidewalk. You cannot include a line item that says budget contingencies. What we recommend is that you build these budget contingencies into the other line items, such as for your materials and for your labor. Remember, you cannot purchase vehicles or equipment with RTP funds. All you can do is rent equipment. If you're unsure what is allowable, you are free to check out 2 CFR 200 Subpart E, the cost principles for eligible and ineligible costs for federal grants, or check out the Federal Highway RTP website. All right, so we're almost done. The last section here, you will see something called discretionary board criteria. This section provides up to 10 points that may be used by the Missouri Trail Advisory Board at their discretion. The board represents a broad range of motorized and non-motorized trail interests throughout the state. This assessment allows board members to bring their specific knowledge of statewide and local recreation patterns, resources, and needs into consideration. Members may award points based on their subjective evaluation of the project application. The supporting document checklist is provided on the application as an aid to project sponsors and should be completed before submitting the application packet. For a detailed summary of each required item on this checklist, go to the application guide in the OPS page and look on page 6 and 7, and it will break down each one of these things and tell you what you need. But I want to point out just a few of these. So for the E-Verify, please make sure that you are including both the federal and Missouri E-Verify. The Missouri E-Verify, you're going to be checking either box A, B, or C, and then you will have to include the affidavit of work authorization. And you can find a copy of this on page 10 and 13 of the application guide in the OPSP. Remember that if your project's on public land and you have a draft of an MOA, if your project is recommended for funding, a signed memorandum agreement will need to be executed. So remember, we're asking you to send in a draft that you and the landowner have jointly worked on and have it ready to go. And then once you are told that you will be receiving funding, you will need to go and have that signed. Also note that there are two different types of maps on this checklist. There is a specific location map and an aerial photo with the project site plan. If you want, you can include these in one map or have two maps. There are templates for the resolution and financial assurance letter, which can be found in the application guide in the OPSP on page 8 and 9. So now I want to show you an example of one map. This is the Greenway Park in Holt Summit. As you can see that their map has overlaid the aerial photo with specific trail information. So what the Trail Advisory Board has told us in the past is that they would prefer one good full-colored map, no bigger than 11 by 17, than a lot of low-quality non-colored maps. So if you need some help on this, please let us know. But on this map, as you can see, it gives us the title and what phase we're in, and then it shows us what maps or what trails are currently there, and then tells us which ones are proposed. It shows us that there's a stream running through, so most likely on the proposed trails, I'm probably going to see a couple of bridges. And so this information has a lot, and then they have actually labeled for us what is on the map as well. So the certification of responsible person is the signature section. A responsible official of the sponsor's agency must sign and date this section to complete the application, or the application will not be scored. So let me reiterate this, is that if you send in your 2 hard copies and they are not signed, then the application cannot be scored. Examples of responsible officials include mayors, city managers or administrators, directors, presidents, executive officers, or chief financial officer. This person or position should be named in the resolution. The responsible official does not need to be the contact person on the application, but does need to read the application and have an understanding of the requirements of administering the grant should one be awarded. The responsible officer cannot be an independent grant writer who is not affiliated with the agency or organization and cannot currently serve as a board member of the Missouri Trail Advisory Board. An incomplete or inadequate application packet will not be eligible for scoring, and handwritten applications will not be scored. The final step is to submit 2 hard copies of the application plus all the supporting document to us by February 16, 2022. So you must have it submitted or postmarked by the February 16, 2022 deadline. Do not email in your final application. If you do, it will not be accepted and will not be scored. Unsigned applications will not be scored as well. The advantage of turning in your application early: if we receive your application before the February 16th deadline, we will review the application and make sure that you have everything that the application should have. So for instance, if it comes in unsigned before the February 16th deadline, we will give you a call and tell you you have until the 16th to get us a signed application, or your application will not be scored. So at the end here is our email address, which is mspgrants@dnr.mo.gov. This is where you will send your courtesy reviews. You can also send questions to this one. And if you need to call Aiden Dicknight, there's her phone number. And like I said, she is the RTP main contact. My number is here as well, which is Patty Reed, and then Rebecca Ross, our sections chief, number is written here as well. Thank you for attending the 2022 RTP Application Workshop.